interesting topic today is how do my crown preps differ when I scan or when I take an impression. So the idea of this webinar is not to tell you how to prep with a little model of every tooth that you're going to see, but it's to put some fundamentals in place so that you can understand where this whole thing comes from. How does it work? So we're going to give a little bit of technical background on scanners itself, a little bit of technical background on how 3D stuff is formed. How is this whole thing working? Because we get bombarded by salespeople about how to buy a scanner at great expense, and then we don't know what's the benefit going to be in the end. And do I actually do something with it, or is it just a expensive impressioning tool? So from my side, I just want to make sure that you guys understand when you do listen to the rep that you at least have a little bit of background. That's number one. Number two is obviously when you prepare, there's a few things that you need to know when you scan. I don't know how experienced you people are in scanning, those of you who are on this webinar. I've got some 20 plus years with scanners, so I know a little bit about what you need to see when you work with them. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. And as I say, there is, if we have to continue with this topic, we'll be busy for 4 days and longer. But for today, let's just get on with it and go and look at what's most important for you and I as practitioners, and what we're going to be needing when we go along. All right. So let me introduce you to the father of CADCAM Dentistry. This is Professor Werner Mormon. He was the Okie that invented CEREC along with Brandestini. This guy is a periodontist. So from a fitting point of view, makes you think, doesn't it? It makes you think that, well, if he's a perio guy, he should be worrying about how things fit, and that there can be a happy periodontium after that. So Professor Mormon is still active today. He's retired, obviously, but he's still running around and attending some of the interesting things that we deal with as a profession. Needless to say, our travel restrictions does make it a little bit different, but I saw him just before COVID last, when this one of these pictures were done. All right. So Christian Lange is a Nobel Prize winner, and he was in the field of internationalism. So the one thing that this guy said is that technology is a useful servant, but a dangerous master. And that really is the case. We submit to all these new things that we have to put into our practices, and then, does it really benefit us? Or is it going to take us somewhere where we don't know where the outcomes are going to be? So just be careful. You need to know a few things about this technology. Otherwise, it's going to become your master. And the idea behind this whole thing is that we're masters. We're managing the technology. AI is a different situation in terms of what we do and what we don't. But we need to make sure that we know the technology that we employ in our practices and that we can trust the technology. And this is part of this is about getting you to know where to trust this machines that we are all acquiring. All right, so when you scan, how does a scanner work? What's the difference between taking an impression and doing a scan? So the first thing, as you can see there, it is always about the light. And in this case, you're seeing something there with almost ambient light. It's light in the distance. So it just goes down to show that where light doesn't reach, you can't record in our situation in dentistry. So if you take a polyvinyl siloxane impression, you probably get some stuff that's going to go into the crevice, and you'll find something that you can work with. But I can assure you, if the light is not going to reach in the interproximal box, you will have no information to design something from that you can make a proper functional restoration from. So we're going to look a little bit about the techniques that we use with iOS scanners. We're going to look at the goal of the scanner. And then I'm going to do a little bit of mathematics. Now mathematics for me is a serious challenge to my IQ. So I'm only going to touch on how 3D reconstruction really works. Okay. So we have two types of techniques, and the one is a passive technique, and those are when we buy fairly cheap cameras that makes use of the ambient light. It just makes use of light around it. In other words, it has no projection, and it doesn't increase the intensity of the light in terms of the object. So what they need, what these types of cameras need, is a structure or a texture that is very well defined. Otherwise, you will have problems creating a 3D surface. It will not give you proper information to create your surface with. The other technique, obviously, is active techniques. And that's now where the dentistry comes in a little bit more. And most of the scanners on the market today, and especially the better scanners, are obviously all based in active light management. And most of these make use of red, white, and blue rays, structured light. In other words, it's directed light. I suppose you can almost call it a laser. It's just the intensity that is different. So the luminous point projection is what most cameras are based on, and it's called confocal, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But it depends on the distance it is from the object to calculate where the surface is. And it calculates this by hundreds of thousands, and some of the cameras can do millions of data points. That's what we call them, per second, or points of interest per second. And this through a process called triangulation. All of this will be calculated, and it will give you the creation of a surface later on. All right, so let's just see how this works. So on the right-hand side, you can see a camera with high intensity, and the far right is one with a bit lower intensity. What we mean by that is the amount of data points that gets produced by your camera or your intraoral scanner will relate directly to the quality and the matrix of the file that you'll be creating afterwards. So it will help you to generate a nice surface, which is going to be the prep in the end, which is going to be the surface of your prep. So as you can see, the camera on the left is a well-known camera that does about 500,000 data points, or almost 1 million data points, in fact, per second. And the other one is obviously showing a lesser amount of data points. So what do we mean by extreme points? So when there are points that do not fall directly within the level of the surface, in other words, you have a peak or a valley that is not really going to coincide with creating a 3D surface, that will just be thrown away. And that in that way, you reduce the noise. In other words, you increase the clarity of what your picture is going to look like. Now, from all these millions and millions of little data points, call it a pixel if you want, then maybe some people will understand that a little bit better. But from all these little points, an STL file. Now, an STL is surface tessellation. That surface tessellation language then creates a surface from which you are going to work on a virtual model. So remember, your model is not real, it's virtual, it's on your computer. All right. So all those calculated points that are coincident with each other in different images. Remember, your camera is moving. So you're moving the scanner over the area, and every time that you make a micron's worth of movement, you are taking in more points of interest, and those points of interest are all added together, and this will then generate your file. So you can see that the little picture indicates triangulation. Now there you see all these little polymorphs, that's what we call them. These little polymorphs are all put together and they work on a X, Y, and Z axis. And that gives you the three-dimensional capability for the software and for the to reconstruct with from the information that it gets from the light source. Now, as you can see on picture A, there's a widely spread mesh. Picture B is a little bit more tight, and then picture C is a really very complex mesh. And those complex meshes gives you more detail, especially in areas like the margin. So on picture A, you won't have a clear margin, but you will also have a surface texture that may be very uneven. Because remember, these triangles are connected by straight lines. Now, remember, these straight lines are infinite, and it can be, it's not something that your eye will see in terms of the distance. So the quality of the mesh is directly related to how good your intraoral scanner can work with the information that it gains from projecting light onto the surface. So therefore we say the density of the mesh, if that is increased, it also gives you a better quality surface so that you can produce a better fitting crown later on. So let's just look a little bit at the clinical impact of these technologies, because this is why you're here, is to know what it does. So if we look at traditional workflow, you take an impression, you make a model, you send it away, casts, gets done by someone in the lab, you receive it back, the crown is high, patient complains, you're upset, or so on. On the digital way, the patient comes in, you scan, implants gets done. It gets done in 3D printing or milling, depending if you're using a reducing or an additive type of process. As we work with glass ceramics at the moment, it's mostly reducive processes. And the appliance delivery, generally speaking, very good in terms of occlusion and very good in terms of the fit. And also, it gives you the ability to do a chairside workflow with some of the companies and the products that they produce for us. So therefore, if you do go to the clinical way, you can actually save time in producing the same structure that you would have done over a week. You can now do in a day or two. It also, as I say, brings you one visit dentistry. So depending on where you want to fit into using intraoral scanner, you can do crowns immediately. You don't have to do anything in amalgam anymore. I hope not. I really hope no one's using amalgam anymore. You don't have temporaries. And then the other thing is, and this you will see coming up next, is people are really, really impressed with the fact that you've got a camera and you don't have to put their mouth full of some impression material. Yeah, gag reflex is seriously reduced. All right. So this is just some reports from the studies that people feel that digital impressioning technique is way more comfortable to patients than what we're doing currently. And then apart from the fact that it is more comfortable for the patient, like I said, most of the impressioning with intraoral scanners that we do today are those using confocal technology, which means it projects light and in a pixel size and then collects all the information from there. Is short technique. It's quick. The scans are very quick. If you take into account it's winter now, Your improgram takes quite a while to set. This is between 40 and 50 and maybe even less than a minute. You can create upper and lower scans that are totally adequate to provide you with a crown restoration afterwards. All right, so as you can see, there people like much more to go with the technology than to go with the old school way of doing impressions. So now, how do you use this impression machine to make you create a proper crown? First and foremost, you need to use some pathways, because you need to give the camera, or the software at least, you need to give it some information so that it can continue and build a model. So the use of pathways is a great way to get your scan time down, and also to make sure that you get all the information that you need for your impression. Remember, you're going to design the crown on that now, and this is what we're going to talk about, is crown preparations. All right, so tracking just means that you have to make sure that you can give the camera opportunity to continue. The distance from the object, normally between 50 and 30 millimeters. On average, 5 and 30 millimeters, apologies for that. But you're normally about between 5 and 10 millimeters away from the object when you do take. 30 millimeters, it's quite a big mouth. It'll keep you busy for a while. The other thing we need to talk about is, and a lot of the people that are not well acquainted with digital technology is always very quick to talk about the accuracy of these instruments. I can tell you the accuracies are within the ranges of any of the best impression materials that you can buy, and there's a lot of research available for that, especially if you go and look at the International Journal for Computerized Dentistry from the ICD. You will see that Professor Albert Mehl and Andreas Ender has done a lot of research in terms of accuracy of these intraoral scanners. So there's two terms that you need to know. The one is trueness and the other one is precision. So trueness means how close can you get that what you have scanned to the real object. So if you've scanned a maxilla, which is say 120 mils in length all round from 8 to 8, then hopefully your scan is also exactly that same amount, down to microns. When we talk about precision, is how many times can you repeat that? Same thing, but how many times can you repeat the action and get exactly the same result? So as you can see on that little scale, it shows you how it works there. So as you increase your trueness and you increase your precision, your accuracy will be better. So now the second part in our lead up to making crowns, or designing crowns and prepping crowns, we need to understand the manufacturing point. So now that you've got a little bit of an information on how the information is generated, how is this information now taken from virtual into the real thing? How is it going to make you the crown or your bridge or whatever you are going to place for your patient? So we need to understand how these milling machines work, because that is going to modify the way that you prepare so that you can actually produce a reliable restoration. Okay, so the first things that you need to understand is the software is going to create an outer shell and the inner shell. The outer shell is obviously the surface of your crown that's going to be in contact with the opposing dentition. That is the visible part in the mouth. So shading and all kinds of things like that comes into play there. Obviously, the occlusion is most important, and then the margination is very important. On your inner shell, you have the fitting surface. That fitting surface is created by the software in in accordance as a negative of the object that you scanned. So this is where it links to how you're prepping. It's important to prep in such a way that you can actually reproduce this physically. All right. So there we have it. The outer shell, that's your part to design, and that's created by or based on a proposal that the software gives you, and you can go and adjust. No matter, we're not talking about specific softwares here. We're talking about everybody, all the companies. So the crown can be adjusted, whether it's you, whether it's your technician, doesn't really matter. Whoever, anybody that works on can change that. But the inner surface is non-changeable. The only changes that you can bring about is parameter settings, i.e., if you make a spacer, there are ideal parameters for spacers, there are ideal parameters for your margins, and so forth. So these things you can't really change. In most cases, there are factory settings from the companies, but you can adjust them in terms of value, but you cannot change the shape or form thereof. Okay, let's go. So what do you need to know when you're prepping? You need to understand how thick the material is going to be. You need to know quite a bit about materials for CADCAM. But like I said, if we go through all of this, all of us will be here for a while. So let's just have a quick look and say that normally when the material is calculated, the spacer thickness has to be deducted. So if you have a material thickness of 2000 microns, then you have to take away 120 microns. So you're now going to have a restoration 1980 in thickness. Am I right? Maybe 1890. No, I told you my math's not so great. But in any event, you got to deduct the thickness of the spacer from your materials. And the spacer is there for your luting cement. So if you make that too small, then the fit is going to be too tight. And then you won't be able to seat your crown properly. And you'll see as we go along now, when we start looking at the prepping techniques exactly, then you will understand why we say this. All right. The next thing that you need to know is when you make a crown through a mechanical device such as a milling unit, you need to understand that the milling unit has got tolerances, and it also has burrs that it has to produce your crown with. When we work in glass ceramics being your porcelains, your Emaxes, and materials the like, lucite glasses, all those things that are glass ceramics that gets sintered, and well, some of them you don't have to, but mostly speaking, we are all onto Emax from time to time, here and there. When you do have that material, then you have to sinter it. That is a glass ceramic, an infiltrated glass ceramic, and that you have to make sure that it's going to be cut by a diamond burr. The minimum thickness of those burrs for most of the systems varies with a tip of the burr 0.6 millimeters to 2.5. So when you prepare, you've got to take that into consideration. So let's have a look at a crown now. So now we get down to the prep. This is what you came in for. So now we get down to the prep. So if you look on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see the mouse, on the prep itself there, you can understand that the crown, needless to say, has to fit on there, and your margin is around, and you can see the margin that is milled out. So in terms of just software, you would look at an ideal surface shape that is very smooth on the inside, that coincides 100% with the form of the object that you scan, your prep, in other words. But what if your prep is too thin at the top, and the machine is going to create a milling pathway on a certain mathematical calculation where the burr has to move along, then the diamond that cuts the burr might be wider. Remember I said about the 0.6. the diamond might be a little bit wider, or your crown tip is thinner. So in order to produce the negative, you're going to get a problem with your mole over there. So that's number one feature of anterior crowns when you prep them. Be very, very careful of the width of your incisal part of your prep. And this is exactly what will happen. So if you prepare a narrow tip and you are going to have a milling device, the drill bit is going to determine how far you are milling this out. Now, in a case like this, we talk about an overmill in this area, and that will be a weak point where the crown will fracture. So the ideal prep in this instance would be rather to have a shorter axial height, but to have a wider space over there. That will give you a better fit on your crown. The same goes for posterior. So by default, if we are milling crowns, 99.9% it will be a glass ceramic of sorts. That includes that you are going to mill zirconia. You need to understand that you cannot have sharp line angles because you are going to create overmills on the inside. So when you prepare in the posterior component now, you need to prepare so that you get soft round edges so that the milling unit number one can create a proper fitting surface of your crown, and that you can have a stronger restoration. Even if that means that you have to sacrifice 0.5 mil of height, it will not lessen your retention. And then by the most of it, we're all talking about bonding nowadays. And you can see there's a name at the bottom that says Dennis J. Fassbinder. Dennis Fassbinder says, trust your cement and trust your bonding process. All right. So one of the other design considerations, if you are scanning and if you are milling, you need to understand that you have to have a chamfer. That goes because you need a porcelain on the end, and the milling properties of a porcelain, there's a thing called a chipping rate. And when you prepare and that area is thin like this, you will have a chipping or chipped margin on your porcelain that will not be a proper seal. So in order for your intraoral scanner to create a proper margin, you need to at least leave it with a 0.3 or 300 microns, if you want, margin on the marginal side of the crown, and not leave it with just a flat surface, because you cannot read that flat surface. You need that contrast in order to have your scanner give you proper information so that you can create a proper crown. The other thing that is incredibly important, and remember we said in the beginning, it's all about light. What is incredibly important is that when you have areas like this, which are undercuts, you will mill out an undercut, and then you will not be able to seat your crown. And yet again, you will have marginal problems then. So in this case, if we look at this prep from the side on here in the middle, we can see a nice chamfer over there. On this side, we have no chamfer. So the scanner cannot pick up a proper margin, number one. And number two is you have an undercut over there, which will mill out and give you quite a bit of trouble when it comes to your seating of your crown. Another thing that's most important is to understand that you've got to avoid angled preparations. This is root of placement issues. So if you're now going to try and get your contact okay over here, you might find that this contact is not going to work. And by the time you have the crown so that you can position it, you will have problems with contact points. So when you do your preps, you need to try and prep upright as much as possible so that the camera can always see, the iOS intraoral scanner can always see the margin at the bottom. Otherwise, you need to change your route of placement. In most of the softwares, you have the opportunity to adjust your angulation in terms of placing your crown, but there are areas where if your crown is too angulated, you will not be able to seat the crown again. Another thing that is very, very important to consider is if you are going to make sharp line angles, like we did with old school metal-based crowns, where we needed to prepare a tentative form, if you prepare that, you are going to create notch stress. In other words, you'll increase the stress on a specific point in your crown, which will lead to fracture of the porcelain from the inside, not from the occlusal surface, but from the inside. On this picky here, you can see that they've indicated that you make a long, soft transition. And that soft transition spreads the bite force and all the other forces that are involved, bonding, the shrinkage, all those things when you do polymerization. And it settles down the stress within the material, which is going to be your restorative material. Okay. So now let's go and look at a bit of our preparation considerations. Now, this is a study from British Dental Journal. Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs that we have a study that says on the evidence of this survey, we don't know what we are doing. Those RBCs are resin bonded crowns. So it's a nice way of saying we're prepping crap. It is what it is. We need to understand that because most of us nowadays you pushed for time and you need to get on with it and all the rest of it. But please, guys, don't let it affect your quality of workmanship. And this is straight down. This thing directly says our preps are not so good. So let's go and have a look at some of the prep considerations further from this. By the way, the crowns that you see on the picture there are all made by CADCAM chairside. Okay. So one of the considerations, and this is one of the bugbears of my life, is that minimally invasive versus adequately prepared. So we get forced this minimally invasive thing down our throats. But in the end, do we prepare properly in order to give the patient a longevity and a good result for the restorations that we are actually charging them for? So let's go and look at a definition for minimally invasive. A systematic respect for original tissues. In other words, that doesn't mean don't prepare. If you are going to work in ceramics, I hear all the stories about people saying, oh, you don't have to prepare and you can do prep less veneers. There's also last less veneers. You might remind yourself that about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lot about veneers that were so thin that you had to use a refractory model to make them. I've noted personally that whole discussion has gone very quiet. And you know, when discussions go away, there's generally a problem with them. So what will happen to the porcelain is it will crack. No matter whether you bond onto enamel only, the porcelain will crack because there will be stress and tension in the porcelain in the bonding process. Remember, you still have a luting cement that is going to shrink under light when you cure. So microfracture can happen, and you will not know about that until about 6 months to a year down the line. And then you have to start explaining why things are breaking. And the other thing that I just need to mention here is there's some very, very fine material engineers building our materials. And we need to work with the materials with respect to those guys too. They know what they're talking about. So yes, they want to make it as thin as possible, just as we want. But there are certain requirements in glass ceramics that you cannot change. We cannot change the glass structure. It is what it is, and we need to understand the physical properties of glass structure when we work with them. There's one that missed here. All right, sorry guys, I note there's a slide not here, but the next slide says adequately prepared, and adequately prepared only says that you have to remove enough tissue so that you can provide the patient with a successful prosthodontic follow-up. In other words, that you can create a proper restoration once you have prepared. It still doesn't mean you just cut away. You still do minimally invasive. You still have a systematic respect, but you have to join the two concepts together so that whatever you prepare can restore afterwards. So let's look a little bit at what happens when we do take those ceramics into account. What does your preparation margin look like? The choice of burr here is so that, number one, you want to try and end in enamel. So please, if you are the first guy that's going to prepare a crown, please don't cut the CEJ away. Respect the cement to enamel junction at all times. If you have inherited an old crown where there was no CEJ, it's old metal-based crown from 100 years gone by, it's a different story. But in the instance where you are now the first person, please try and stay within the CEJ. And, or at least stay coronal to the CEJ. The other thing that's important is the J margin. So if your crown, if you prepare your crown, you need to use a big enough burr on the labial surface or on the buccal surface and on the palatal surface or lingual surfaces, so that number one is you do not prepare a margin which is going to be a sharp J margin. That sharp margin will absolutely destroy the accuracy of your intraoral scanner. Okay. Then in terms of the internal shapes of your crown preps, whether it's a posterior crown or anterior crown, when you prepare a crown, you need to have simple shapes. Don't know who of you guys remember Prof. Hannes Nel from Pretoria. He used to say, ceramic dentistry is a license for bad dentistry. And you have to put that into context. It only meant that you cannot go and prepare those super sharp angles. So in the case where you're going to work with a scanner, 99.95% you are going to prepare something which is going to be restored with a glass material, and therefore you need to use soft, rounded shapes on the internal surface, as smooth as possible, and all the transition areas as soft as possible. One of the things is that is a nice theoretical is that you always have to be 0.7 millimeters away from the pulp. Now we all know that if you find patients with attritions and fractures and all kinds of things, that sometimes you are very, very close to the pulp. We can then protect the pulp by doing some direct bonding or sealing the pulp or whatever necessary. A discussion for another day on how many things we put onto the dentine. But in general, try and stay away from the pulp by at least 700 microns. Ceramic material, the minimal thickness on the radial edges are mostly by manufacturer prescription, and these are normally in the region of radial thickness of about 500 microns. You can go a little bit thinner, but then remember you still have to deduct 120 odd for your spacer. On the occlusal thickness, if you are going to use a good old feldspathic porcelain crown in the posterior component, you need 2,000 microns. If you are going to use zirconia, you can go down to 500. If Emax nowadays says that they can go to 500, but please remember, you still have to deduct your spacer material. All right. Now here's where adequately prepared was hiding. It was supposed to be directly after the other oak. So the fundamental principles for a predictable success of prosthodontic treatment. Most important, it doesn't help you do non-prep and then you keep on fixing up the problem. You need to prepare in a way that you can provide proper support for the patient. So when we prepare, there's a few guidelines that we have to consider. And we need to use, nowadays, we have them, occlusal and buccal depth guides. When you do your occlusal reduction, make sure that you have at least an idea of how deep you are going so that you can have enough porcelain on the occlusal surface. In terms of interproximal reduction and buccal reduction, depth guides will help you to not just cut all the enamel into oblivion. So make sure that you use these guides. You get 300 microns and 500 microns. And then you also get some barrel burrs for occlusal that gives you 1,000 microns and gives you 2,000 microns. So these things are available. It's in the form of a diamond burr. We all use diamond burrs by the heaps. So we might as well invest in a few of these in our armamentarium when we do go along. So buccal and lingual reduction goes for itself. As far as the bevel on the functional cusp goes, remember in the old days when you had a gold crown or some other metal-based crown, you had a very, very distinct functional buccal cusp bevel. Your bevel on your buccal cusp now has to be soft. You don't have to cut such a sharp bevel because, again, remember the slide about the notch stress? You're going to go back to increasing the stress again. When you finish your prep, you can go down, mostly down to a yellow burr, in most of the instances, a fine or super fine burr. If you have the ultrasonic tips, you can finish your prep with ultrasonic. That gives you a really nice scannable surface. So remember what we spoke about in the level that we're rebuilding 3D surfaces and reconstruction via algorithm. With these finely finished preparations, really do give you a nice scan and nice surface to work with, and you can generate good crowns. And in terms of evaluating your preparation, you don't have to tell anybody what you're seeing. Just go on your little checklist of all the things that we've given you here and go and make sure that you've done all those mental checks prior to doing your scanning. Okay, so let's look at one or two little cases. Those crowns are all done by chairside mechanism. So let's look at a partial crown case. So on the picture on the left here, you will notice the palatal is overlaid. The dentin here is sclerotic. However, the pulp is protected. The margin over there, which is to mesial, was below the soft tissue line, and the intraoral scanner wouldn't be able to pick that margin up unless you have taken the soft tissue away. You can do the soft tissue removal by doing either a laser like we did here, or maybe you can get away by just packing cord, maybe purple. There's normally a good size. Over here, you can see a very small restoration on the disto-occlusal aspect of the fore. That is just a good little composite to be done. Please don't go and mill something out for someone there. That's really not nice to do that. Go and fix that up with a small composite and continue with your overlay. So this case was done in the old days when we used a contrasting powder to create a non-reflective surface for the older cameras to be able to see. And over here, you can see a little bit of work done post-milling to create a nice, minimally invasive, saving the cuspal, at least the palatal wall, and going over to buccal, and a nice restoration result for the patient. Done conservatively, but in a good material and on a good system with a wonderful fit. I think you can agree with me that the soft tissue around this looks nice. And we also got a good color match for this patient. This is an interesting case that came my way. Lady came from overseas, had a VMK crown here, had a VMK crown over here, and a composite overlay or veneer of sorts onto the lateral over there. When you have a look at these preps now, remember they were under a VMK, so I had to work with what I inherited. Have a look at where the margin is situated that we prepare for the scanner. I think you'll agree that that is a fair result. It was about 2.5 hours chair time, and we were able to present the patient with a nice aesthetic option, milled crowns, full ceramics. In this case, we used a material called IPS Empress, and it was the multi-blocks, and they are available from Ivoclar, so that was used in this case. And the veneer on the other side, albeit that the teeth are not perfectly symmetrical, I'm convinced that you can agree with me that the result is a little bit better, and that this is a happy patient and still today is. Yeah, before we go down to all the technology or the technicals of supporting GP Star as a group and becoming a member so that we can create a nice unity in our profession again. Any questions? Thanks for attending. I hope there was some value in this for you. The idea was not to tell you exactly what to prep. The idea was to get you to understand that intraoral scanners needs different things that are important than when we're going to do PVS impressions, and that those are things that you need to be aware of when you do crowns. If you'd like to put in the chat box some topics that you would like for the future, I know we've got an endodontic topic coming up, but maybe, for instance, CADCAM materials or any of the materials for that matter, even all the composites, we can talk about any of those things. It's all related to what we do every day, and it's all to share and share alike. So if you'd like to put an answer in there, you're welcome to do. Go check out the website and see what we really do to try and support practices and make sure that guys run their businesses financially successful and also psychologically successful. You need to go home, remember. So don't hesitate, go and have a look and let us know. Thanks very much for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. See you again.